It was one of those weekends where the weather was perfect for camping. Sunny, with just enough of a breeze to keep things cool at night. I had decided to go camping on my own, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I needed to get away from the noise of everyday life. No phones, no distractions, just the quiet of nature and my own thoughts. I had been to this spot before, a small, secluded area by a creek deep in the woods, a place I had stumbled upon a few years ago on a hiking trip. It wasn't far from the main trail, but far enough to feel like it was my own little world. The creek ran through a small valley, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, making the whole area feel like a hidden oasis. It was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for a solo trip. I parked my car at the trailhead and began the hike down to the camp. It wasn't a long hike, maybe a half-mile or so, but the path was steep, and I had to watch my step as I descended. The air smelled fresh, full of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. When I got to the campsite, I wasted no time setting up my tent. I had brought a lightweight two-person tent, a sleeping bag, and a small stove to cook with. I wasn't planning on making anything fancy, just some soup and a few sandwiches, but it was all I needed. The creek was close enough that I could hear the water running gently over the rocks, and I could already feel the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. Once my camp was set up, I decided to gather some firewood. There was plenty of dead wood around the site, so I didn't have to go far. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was strange, but I figured it was just the time of day. The sun was beginning to set, and maybe the animals were retreating to their dens for the night. I shrugged it off and kept moving, gathering as much wood as I could carry. By the time I had everything back at camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky had turned a deep shade of purple. I built the fire and sat back, watching the flames dance. The crackling of the wood was the only sound now, and I felt a strange sense of calm. There's something about being alone in the woods at night, with nothing but a fire to keep you company. It makes you feel small, insignificant, but in a good way, like you're part of something bigger. I had just started eating when I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. I stopped chewing, listening. It was a rustling sound, coming from somewhere behind me. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I realized that it wasn't the usual sounds I'd hear from those animals. This was different. It sounded too deliberate, like something was moving closer, something that wasn't afraid of me. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably nothing, just the wind or a branch shifting in the breeze. But then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I stood up, walking cautiously toward the sound. I didn't want to be paranoid, but something about it didn't sit right. I stood there for a few seconds, straining to hear. The rustling stopped. Complete silence. I scanned the trees, but everything was still. I convinced myself that I was just being jumpy, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to go back to the fire, maybe cook a bit more, just to distract myself. But as soon as I turned my back, I heard it again. This time it was much closer, just at the edge of the tree line. My skin prickled, and I froze. The sound wasn't the usual rustling. It was heavier, almost like footsteps, but slow and measured. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, shining the beam into the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, just shadows and the sway of branches. But then I saw something, a figure, just barely visible between the trees, moving silently toward me. It was tall, dark, and it wasn't a deer or any animal I recognized. Panic shot through me, but I didn't move. My instincts told me to stay as still as possible. I watched as the figure shifted in and out of the darkness, getting closer, but still too far away to make out any details. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else, but my gut told me it wasn't just a hiker or another camper. The way it moved didn't seem right. It wasn't the smooth, steady movement of someone used to the woods. It was jerky, almost like it was unsure of where it was going. I kept the flashlight trained on the figure, hoping it would just disappear, but it didn't. Kept coming closer, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but I knew I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned, grabbed my backpack, and started to move as quietly as I could, keeping the fire between me and whatever it was. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I run? Should I stay and confront it? But there was no time for that. The figure was getting closer, and I had no idea if it was dangerous or just curious. I kept moving away from the fire, trying to put distance between me and whatever was out there. My eyes kept flicking back toward the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I moved farther into the woods, the ground beneath my feet became uneven. I had to step carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. The light from my flashlight illuminated the trees in a small circle, but the darkness outside that circle felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. After what felt like hours, I reached a small ridge overlooking the creek. I paused, out of breath, and listened. Everything was silent. No rustling, no footsteps, no signs of anything following me. My mind was on high alert, and I could feel the tension in my muscles, but nothing moved. I looked around, trying to figure out where to go next. I could see the creek below, its water flowing steadily in the darkness, but the path ahead was blocked by thick brush and fallen trees. My only option was to go back toward the camp, but that felt like the worst idea. I spent the next few minutes weighing my options. Should I try to circle around and head back to the car? Or was it too risky to go back the way I came? In the end, I decided to try to make my way back to the trailhead, hoping that whatever I had seen hadn't been following me. I carefully retraced my steps, keeping my eyes and ears open for any signs of movement. The forest was still eerily quiet. It felt like I was the only person in the woods, the only one awake. As I neared the trail, I saw a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat, but it was just a deer, moving quietly through the trees. I let out a long breath, trying to calm myself. When I finally reached the trailhead, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even look back at the woods. I just kept walking, my pace quickening as I neared my car. When I finally reached it, I unlocked the door and got inside, locking it behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I had seen that night, but I knew I wasn't going back there again. The woods, once so peaceful, felt dangerous now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I started the car and drove away, leaving the woods behind. The road stretched out in front of me, the headlights illuminating the darkness, but it felt like the world was closing in. My heart was still racing, but I was thankful to be heading back to civilization. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of my own room felt wrong, like it was too quiet after everything that had happened. I kept thinking about what I had seen in the woods, and whether I'd ever truly be able to explain it. The next day, I told myself that it had just been my imagination. Maybe I had seen a bear, or maybe it was just a hiker I hadn't recognized in the dark. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. It was one of those late summer weekends when everything seemed to be aligned. The weather was perfect, and the plans were simple. A weekend camping trip with some friends at a remote spot near the base of a mountain. We had decided to camp near a river. Clear water, beautiful surroundings, a perfect chance to escape the daily grind. We hiked in after lunch, setting up camp in a small clearing next to a fast-moving stream. There was nothing particularly special about the place at first glance. Just a patch of grass, surrounded by tall pines, and a small fire pit in the center. The kind of spot that didn't scream danger but whispered it quietly in the back of your mind. The kind of place where you couldn't see what was out of sight, but you just knew there was something out there. We got to work unpacking, setting up tents, and gathering wood. The air was warm, but there was a slight chill whenever the breeze picked up. Everything was going smoothly. We had our food, our gear, and the sun was still high in the sky. It wasn't until around dusk that things started to feel off. We were sitting around the fire, drinking some beer, chatting about nothing in particular, when I first noticed something. It was a rustle in the trees on the other side of the river. I hadn't heard anything like it before. The sound wasn't the usual wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, no rabbits moving through the brush. It was different. It was heavier, almost like a person walking in the forest. But there was no one there. I tried to shake it off. Could have been an animal, right? Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But the sound felt too deliberate. Like whatever it was moving on purpose, just out of sight. Not normal. Still, I didn't want to alarm anyone. I just kept my thoughts to myself and carried on. As the firelight flickered, casting long shadows, the rustling continued. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. You know how your imagination starts to run wild when you're out in the woods, especially as night starts to fall? But then I noticed something else. The smell. It wasn't overpowering at first, but it was there. A sour, musty smell, like something had been dead for a while. I looked around, trying to place it, but there was nothing obvious. No dead animals, no decaying plants. It was just the smell. The smell that made your stomach churn and your throat tighten. That's when I started to feel it. The unease creeping in, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. You know the feeling, right? Like you're not alone, but you don't want to turn around to check. That feeling that burrows into the pit of your stomach, telling you something's wrong, but you don't know what. By now, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods around us were dark. The firelight didn't reach far enough to make me feel comfortable. The sounds of the river and the wind in the trees were the only things filling the silence, but those damn rustling sounds persisted. I stood up and grabbed a flashlight from my pack, shining it across the riverbank, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was making the noise. There was nothing, just trees. I shined the light up and down the river, then across the clearing. Still nothing. I felt silly for letting my mind wander. There was nothing out there. But then, something made me stop. There, in the distance, right at the edge of the forest, I thought I saw movement. It was fast, just a brief flash of a shape darting between trees. I froze, my heart pounding. Did I really see something? I blinked, focusing harder. The flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand. For a moment, everything was still. Then the rustling stopped completely, like whatever was moving through the trees had decided to wait. I didn't want to be the first one to break the silence, so I turned and sat back down, trying to act normal. The others didn't seem to notice anything unusual, and we continued chatting around the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. I kept stealing glances toward the trees, wondering if whatever had been out there was still watching. The night wore on, and the sounds of the forest grew louder. Cicadas, frogs, the river. Still, that odd rustling, that eerie sensation, never went away. We made our way to bed, the last of the fire burning out, leaving only the cold embers glowing in the dark. I was in my tent, lying on my back, trying to sleep, when I heard it. A soft, quiet crunching noise outside. I wasn't sure if it was a footstep or the wind, but it was too distinct to ignore. I lay there in the dark, frozen, straining to hear. There it was again. Crunch, crunch, closer this time. My heart pounded as I slowly reached for my flashlight. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was awake. But the curiosity was killing me. What the hell was that? I finally gathered enough courage to unzip the tent flap just a little. The beam of light cut through the dark, trembling in my hand. I scanned the perimeter of the camp. Nothing. I sighed, letting the flap fall back into place. Maybe I was overthinking it. I was just exhausted, my mind running wild. The night was still and quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the glow of the fire. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, but every little noise kept pulling me back to consciousness. The wind in the trees, a snap of a twig, the rustling from the woods again. I finally drifted off, my mind too tired to stay awake, only to be woken by the sudden sound of something large moving through the brush. It was louder now, closer. My eyes shot open. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, just the general direction of the trees by the river. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting. Then I heard it, something heavy dragging across the ground. A low, guttural grunt, like an animal in pain. I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I knew I should have woken the others, but something kept me paralyzed. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. What if it was a bear? What if it was something worse? The noise seemed to grow in intensity, moving closer, then stopping, only to start again, moving in tight, erratic circles. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack and unzipped the tent, slipping out into the night, careful not to make a sound. I moved towards the fire pit, staying low, hoping to get a better look at whatever it was. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, watching. The air was heavy with tension, and I could feel my legs shaking. In the dim moonlight, I saw it. It was big, huge even. It wasn't a bear or anything I recognized. It had the shape of something tall, almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The thing paused, turning its head slightly, as though it sensed me. Stood there in the shadows, completely still. Then, without warning, it bolted off into the woods, moving faster than anything should have been able to. I didn't wait. I ran back to the camp, into the tents, waking everyone, telling them what I saw. We packed up in a hurry, not bothering with subtlety, shoving everything into our bags. The sun hadn't even risen yet, but we weren't staying another minute. We didn't look back as we hiked out, the forest silent behind us. We made it to the car, our hearts still racing, the cold morning air biting at our skin. I still don't know what we saw out there, but I know it wasn't anything normal. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in those woods, and I'll never forget the way it looked at me before it disappeared into the dark. As we drove back down the mountain, I couldn't help but think of all the things we didn't see, what we didn't hear, what was still hidden in the woods, and I wondered if it had followed us out. I remember the night it all happened as if it were yesterday. The air was thick with moisture, the kind of humidity that weighs down on you, making it hard to breathe. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We had heard about this remote spot near a river, tucked deep in the woods where hardly anyone went. It was supposed to be the perfect place to escape. Just the six of us, no distractions, just the peace of nature and the quiet nights under the stars. Or so we thought. The day we arrived, the sun was setting. We unloaded our gear from the cars, setting up tents along the edge of a small clearing near the river. The sounds of the forest surrounded us, but it was different from the usual birds chirping or leaves rustling in the wind. It felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if the forest was watching us. But we shrugged it off. After all, we were there to relax, not overthink. As we settled in, we built a fire, the crackling flames pushing back the chill of the evening. We cooked our food, cracked open some beers, and sat around the fire, joking and telling stories. It was the kind of peaceful night that would have been perfect, if not for the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something about the place just didn't feel right, but I ignored it, focused on the warmth of the fire and the familiar laughter of my friends. The first sign that something was wrong came much later, after the fire had burned down to just a pile of glowing embers. It was around 11 p.m., and we were all starting to wind down. Some of us were getting ready to turn in, others were just staring at the stars above. The woods around us seemed oddly still, as if the forest had gone silent, holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A soft, low noise, like a grunt or a growl, coming from the trees just beyond our campsite. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. But then it came again, louder this time. Not like an animal, but something more deliberate, more human. It sounded like a deep, guttural exhale, followed by a low growl. My skin prickled with the sudden rush of cold fear, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I looked around at my friends, but no one seemed to have heard it. They were either too caught up in their own thoughts or too relaxed to notice. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck with me. As the others began to turn in, I stayed by the fire, staring into the dark woods. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. I finally crawled into my tent around midnight, the sounds of the forest still echoing in my ears. I tried to sleep, but the thought of what I had heard earlier kept me awake. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a deer or some other harmless animal. But the sound, that growl, it was different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made it wasn't just passing by. It had been lingering, watching us. The night dragged on, and I managed to doze off in fits and starts. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke to a noise that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a growl this time, but the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were too close, too steady. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to hide. It knew we were here, and it was moving closer. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear the rustling of leaves, followed by that same low grunt I had heard earlier. I lay there, completely still, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. But then I heard it again, closer this time, right outside my tent. My entire body tensed, and I thought for a moment I might pass out from the sheer terror. The footsteps started up again, but now they were moving away. Slowly, the sound of the steps faded into the distance. My mind raced. What the hell was that? Couldn't have been an animal. It sounded too human. Maybe it was someone else camping nearby, playing some kind of prank. But then why hadn't they said anything? Why didn't they call out? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every creak of the tent fabric, every whisper of the wind making my heart race. The first light, I couldn't get out of that tent fast enough. The others were already up, sitting around the fire, chatting like everything was normal. I tried to act like nothing had happened, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. We spent the day hiking around, but the feeling never left me. Every time we stopped, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. The forest felt too quiet, too still. Even the animals seemed to be avoiding us, leaving the woods eerily silent. That night, as we sat around the fire again, I decided to bring it up. I mentioned the growls and the footsteps from the night before. The others laughed it off, saying I'd probably just heard some animal. But I wasn't convinced. I didn't tell them about the footsteps, or how it felt like something had been out there, waiting. As the night wore on, the tension between us grew. I could see it in their eyes. Everyone was on edge. Even though no one said it out loud, we all felt the same thing. We weren't alone. Around 11:30 p.m., just as I was about to crawl into my tent, I heard it again. This time, much closer than before. A deep, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving rapidly toward us. My heart stopped. I turned to my friends, but they were already standing up, their faces pale and wide-eyed. We all heard it, and we all knew that it wasn't a bear, or a deer, or anything else we had been told to expect. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and I could feel the air shift, a heavy presence pressing in on us from all sides. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Everything went dead silent. No wind, no rustling, nothing. We didn't wait around to figure out what it was. Without saying a word, we grabbed our gear and scrambled into the cars. The forest had turned from peaceful to suffocating, and none of us felt safe anymore. We didn't care about the campsite or our plans for the next day. All we cared about was getting out of there. The drive back felt like the longest stretch of road I'd ever been on. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had happened. By the time we reached the nearest town, the fear had started to fade, replaced by confusion and a sense of relief. But none of us spoke about it again, and over time, it became one of those things we all knew happened but never discussed. In the end, we never went back to that spot. And though I never learned what caused the sounds that night, or who or what was in those woods with us, I learned one thing. Sometimes the wilderness holds its secrets tightly, and some things are better left unexplained. We had been hiking for hours, the sun starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was thick, the kind of dense woods where the sunlight barely touches the ground, leaving everything in a dull half-light. It was the perfect kind of camping trip we were all hoping for. Peaceful, isolated, far away from the noise of the city. My friends and I had planned this for months. We'd been looking forward to this weekend for so long that we didn't even mind the sweat running down our backs or the sore muscles from the hike. The excitement of being out here, away from everything, made it all worth it. We had chosen a secluded spot by a small creek, a few miles deep into the woods, where we set up camp. It wasn't much, just a few tents and a campfire crackling away. The sound of the creek flowing was calming, and the firelight cast flickering shadows on the nearby trees. The air had a crisp, fresh feel to it, mixed with the earthy scent of pine. It was perfect, the kind of place you could imagine spending days just unwinding, letting everything go. After setting up camp, we gathered around the fire, talking about old times, planning the next day's hike. It was a typical night of camping with friends, lighthearted, carefree. We made jokes, ate canned beans and hot dogs, and washed it all down with warm beer. The sky above us was clear, the stars scattered like diamonds against a dark velvet backdrop. It was a night that felt timeless. But as the evening wore on, things started to feel a little off. At first, it was small things, like the occasional rustle in the trees, the sound of something moving just beyond the light of the fire. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the wind or an animal wandering by. But the more I listened, the more I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the sounds, either. There was this strange stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath, felt, waiting. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, despite the warmth of the fire. I wasn't the only one who felt it. One by one, my friends started to quiet down. They must have felt it too, the shift in the air. We all sat there, staring at the flames, not saying much. The sound of the creek had started to feel more distant, as if the flow had slowed, or maybe it was just that the forest around us had become so eerily silent. The wind had stopped entirely, and there was no chirping of crickets or rustling of leaves, just a heavy silence. We didn't talk about it, but we all knew something was wrong. After a while, we decided to turn in for the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the darkness of the forest outside our small circle of light seemed to close in on us. We retreated to our tents, trying to ignore the growing unease. I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to push the weird feeling out of my mind. I had camped before, and this was nothing new. The woods were always quiet at night, right? That was just how it was. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound had me jerking awake. Branches snapping, twigs breaking, the soft padding of something moving through the underbrush. At one point, I swear I heard a low growl, something too deep and too guttural to be anything I recognized. My mind raced, wondering if it was just an animal or something worse. I lay there for what felt like hours, eyes wide open, staring at the inside of my tent, waiting for something to happen. Then the silence hit again. Not the quiet of the night, but a deeper, more profound kind of silence. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. There was something out there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there, waiting. I could almost feel its eyes on me through the thin fabric of my tent. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the soft sounds of the forest started to return. A rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. But even then, something still didn't sit right. I could hear my friends moving around in their tents, shifting and groaning, as if they, too, were having trouble sleeping. I finally dozed off, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, feeling like I was being watched, my dreams full of shadows and movement. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something I couldn't ignore. It started as a faint sound, so faint that I thought I was imagining it. A low grunt, almost like a snort, coming from somewhere in the woods. I froze, straining to hear it again. Then it came clearer this time, louder. A deep, throaty snarl, followed by more movement. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a bear or a deer. It was something bigger. I reached for my flashlight, trying not to make a sound. Slowly, I unzipped my tent just enough to poke my head out, shining the beam of light into the dark. Nothing. I waited, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then, just as I was about to turn off the light and tell myself it was nothing, I saw it. A shape moving slowly and silently, just on the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was a person, but there was something wrong about the way it moved. It didn't walk like a human. It slunk along the shadows, its body low to the ground, almost like an animal. It stopped for a moment, and I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The flashlight beam flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the dark patch of trees where it had been. My mind was racing. Was it just an animal? Was I seeing things? My heart was still pounding in my chest, and the adrenaline coursed through me, keeping me wide awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching us. I didn't dare leave my tent to check on the others. What if I was just scaring myself? What if it was just an animal? Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I finally convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that I needed to get some sleep if I wanted to make it through the hike tomorrow. But sleep never came. Every little sound outside, every movement in the trees, had me alert and on edge. At dawn, I got out of my tent, hoping that the morning light would bring some clarity to what had happened. The others were already stirring, rubbing their eyes and yawning, looking groggy but unaware of the tension in the air. I didn't mention the figure or the growls. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. It sounded crazy even to my own ears. We packed up camp and set out on our hike for the day, trying to push the unease behind us. The woods seemed different now, more oppressive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shape again, but it never appeared. The rest of the day was uneventful, just the usual hiking, talking, and joking around. But the memory of what had happened the night before stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept thinking about that growl, about the strange way the figure moved. There was no doubt in my mind now that it wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light. Something was out there. When we finally made it back to camp that evening, it was late again. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the forest was already wrapping itself in the heavy blanket of darkness. I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. I kept glancing around, my eyes darting into the shadows between the trees. We made dinner, talking more than usual, trying to fill the silence with conversation. But the firelight flickered, and the trees seemed to whisper in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just waiting for the right moment. That night, I kept my flashlight close, my ears straining for any sound that would confirm my fears. Every time a twig snapped or the wind shifted, I held my breath. I didn't sleep well at all, and when morning finally came, I was more than ready to leave. We packed up quickly the next morning, all of us eager to get back to the safety of civilization. As we hiked out of the woods, the silence felt almost oppressive. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but nothing ever followed us. When we finally reached the trailhead, I felt a huge sense of relief wash over me. The woods were behind us, and whatever had been out there stayed with it. I didn't talk about what had happened, and neither did my friends. We were just happy to be back in the open, far away from whatever had been watching us. I don't know what it was out there in the woods that night, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the woods are more than just trees and animals. Sometimes there's something else. Something that doesn't want you to feel safe. Something that thrives in the silence. And whatever it was, I don't think it ever really left. It was just waiting for the right moment to come back. I was with a small group of friends camping at a place we'd never been before. It was a bit off the beaten path, tucked away in a dense part of the woods where the trees formed a thick canopy overhead. The air smelled like fresh pine and the ground was soft with moss. The campfire crackled, sending tiny embers up into the air, and we were all sitting around it, talking, laughing, and just enjoying the quiet of the woods. We hadn't planned for anything unusual. It was just supposed to be a quiet weekend in the wilderness. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the world for a couple of days, hike some trails, sleep under the stars, and eat some hot dogs by the fire. But from the moment we arrived, there was something strange about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it. The air felt heavier, like the weight of the forest itself was pressing down on us. Maybe it was just because it was such a remote location, or maybe it was because none of us had been this far out before. But something about the whole place made me uneasy. We'd set up our tents in a small clearing by a stream. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming, almost soothing, but there was something unnerving about it, too. It wasn't just the noise, but the way it seemed to echo off the trees, making everything feel more isolated. The first night passed without incident. We sat around the campfire late into the night, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Eventually, we all went to bed, and I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the steady sound of the stream. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I'm not sure what woke me, but I had the sense that something wasn't right. I lay there, staring up at the inside of my tent, listening to the noises around me. The wind was rustling the leaves of the trees, and the stream was still flowing. But there was another sound now, something soft, almost like a whisper that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe one of my friends walking around. But then it came again, closer this time. A faint rustling, like something moving through the brush. My heart started beating faster. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence of something out there, watching. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just held my breath, hoping whatever it was would go away. The sound stopped for a few moments, and I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But then it came again. This time it was much louder. Something was moving through the underbrush, brushing against the leaves and branches. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check. Slowly, I unzipped the flap of the tent just a little and peeked outside. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I could see the outline of the other tents nearby, but there was no one moving around. The campfire had long since died down, and everything was quiet again. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw a shape. It was tall, at least 6 feet, standing completely still. I couldn't make out much detail, but I could tell it wasn't one of my friends. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a moment, I thought maybe it was an animal, something big like a deer or a bear. But there was something about the way it stood that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the way an animal would act. It was too still, too deliberate. And then, I noticed something even more disturbing. The way the shape seemed to blend into the shadows, like it was part of the darkness itself. I pulled my head back into the tent, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed, unsure whether I should wake up my friends or just stay hidden and hope it would go away. But before I could make a decision, the sound came again. Closer this time, much closer. I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, crunching through the dry leaves. My breath caught in my throat. The figure had moved. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear it moving around the clearing, circling the camp. The sound was unmistakable now. It was a person, or at least something trying to sound like one. I didn't know if I should scream or stay quiet. I felt utterly helpless. If something was out there, it was too close. My mind raced with thoughts of what it could be. Maybe someone had come across the trail, someone lost or just wandering through the woods. But no, this wasn't right. Whoever or whatever it was wasn't acting like a lost hiker. I lay there, frozen, listening as the steps continued to circle the camp. I had no idea how long it went on. but it felt like hours. The tension was unbearable. I had to do something, anything, but I didn't know what. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The clearing was quiet again. No more footsteps, no more rustling. I waited, listening to the night, but now the forest didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt oppressive, like it was closing in around me. I thought about waking my friends, but I wasn't sure if I could do it without sounding crazy. What if they didn't believe me? What if I was just hearing things? Eventually, I mustered the courage to unzip my tent and step outside. The air was cold against my skin, and the ground felt damp under my feet. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The shape was gone, but I still felt it. The presence, the feeling that something was watching me, was still there. I walked around the camp, trying to make sense of what had happened. I checked the other tents, and one of my friends, Kyle, had his flashlight on, looking around. He must have heard something, too. We met by the fire pit, and he looked just as shaken as I felt. We didn't say much. There was nothing to say. We both knew something had been out there, something that shouldn't have been. We didn't talk about it anymore, but neither of us went back to sleep that night. Instead, we stayed up, watching the shadows, listening for any sound that might give us a clue as to what had been lurking in the darkness. The rest of the night passed without incident. By morning, the sun had risen, and the forest seemed almost normal again. The birds were singing, and the world felt safe, like nothing unusual had happened. But I knew better. Whatever had been out there, circling our camp, was still out there somewhere, waiting in the woods. We packed up quickly, not saying much to the others, just eager to get out of the forest and back to the safety of the road. The drive home was quiet, and no one mentioned what had happened the night before. But I could tell they felt it too. The unease, the lingering fear. Even now, as I think back on that night, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting. And every time I go camping, I can't help but feel that same sense of unease. Like the woods are hiding something, and it's always watching. But I've never gone back to that spot again. It had been a long day of hiking and setting up camp. I was on a solo trip, determined to experience the wilderness on my own terms. I wanted to leave behind the noise and stress of the world and find some solitude in the woods. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one felt different, more remote, more intense. I was deep into the forest, miles away from the nearest trailhead, the kind of place where, if something went wrong, it would take hours or even days to get help. I had picked a small clearing near a stream, with a few large trees around to provide shade, and I had set up my tent and gear in the early afternoon. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was peaceful, the kind of stillness you rarely find in the modern world. I could hear the rustling of the leaves, the occasional bird call, and the soft burble of the stream. I built a small fire, making sure to clear away the brush and set up the stones properly. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air, and I sat back on my camp chair, enjoying the warmth on my face. I had a simple meal planned, nothing fancy, just some dehydrated food I'd brought along. As I ate, I thought about how quiet it was out here, how far away I felt from civilization. It was almost eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. As the darkness crept in, the forest became even more silent. The animals had gone to their hidden places, and the only sound left was the crackling fire and the occasional breeze through the trees. I felt a strange sense of unease, not from anything obvious, but from the silence itself. The kind of silence that presses in on you, the kind that makes you feel small and exposed. I finished my meal and leaned back in my chair, staring up at the stars. It wasn't a cloudy night, and the sky was clear enough that I could make out the constellations. It was beautiful, no doubt, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself it was just the wilderness, just my mind running wild, but still, something didn't sit right. I eventually decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight, checked that I had a knife in my pocket, and stepped out of the small clearing. The forest was dense here, the trees tall and thick, their branches weaving together to form a canopy above. The ground was uneven, covered with roots, rocks, and fallen leaves. I didn't mind, it wasn't the first time I'd walked through these kinds of woods. But the deeper I went, the more aware I became of the sounds around me. The faint rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs underfoot, the occasional bird call. All of it felt louder than usual, more pronounced. I wandered for about 20 minutes, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The moon was high now, casting faint light through the trees and making the shadows stretch long across the forest floor. I came across an old fallen tree, its trunk half-rotted and covered in moss. I decided to sit on it for a while, thinking about how good it felt to be this far away from everything. It was supposed to be just me and the forest, just solitude. Yet, I couldn't stop thinking about the quiet, how unnatural it felt. As I sat there, I heard something, a faint rustling sound. It was subtle but unmistakable. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the knife in my pocket. I waited, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a rabbit. Nothing to worry about. Still, I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. I started to walk back toward camp, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The rustling had been too deliberate, too unnatural. It wasn't the usual night noises I was used to. My mind was racing now, and every little sound seemed amplified. The rustling happened again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was a bear, a deer, or something else entirely, but I knew I wasn't alone out here. The rational part of my mind told me it was probably nothing, just an animal, maybe curious about me. But that part of me that was trained to listen to my instincts, the part of me that had been in the woods enough to know when something felt wrong, was screaming that this was not normal. I started walking faster, my pace quickening until I was almost running. My flashlight flickered as I pushed through the thick underbrush, the forest seeming to close in around me. The rustling continued, now much closer. I could hear something breathing, shallow and rhythmic, like it was trying to stay hidden. Panic began to take over. I shouldn't have left the clearing. I shouldn't have gone so far. But now there was no turning back. The noise was too close. I could feel it. It was right behind me. I broke into a sprint, my heart pounding in my chest as I crashed through the woods. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but the sounds, the breath, the rustling, it wasn't right. It was following me, getting closer, the sounds of movement increasing with every step I took. I dared not turn around. I just needed to get back to the camp. The safety of the fire, the warmth of the light. It felt miles away, but I pushed on. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, crashing to the ground with a grunt. My flashlight flew from my hand and landed several feet away, its beam flashing erratically as it rolled. I scrambled to get up, my palms scraped raw from the fall, my breath coming in gasps. There was no time. I had to keep moving. I had to get to the fire. When I finally reached the clearing, I didn't stop. I dove into the camp, grabbed my flashlight, and fumbled for the matches to restart the fire. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus, striking the match and holding it to the dry tinder. Slowly, the flame grew, casting light around the small circle of camp. I stood there, panting, watching the dark trees beyond the firelight. Nothing was moving now. The forest was still, almost too still. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. I kept my eyes fixed on the trees, waiting for something, anything, to move. Minutes passed, and the tension began to drain away, but the unease remained. I sat down on the ground, my back against a tree, still gripping the knife in my hand. I knew I had to stay alert. I couldn't let my guard down. Not here, not after what I had felt. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the shadows dance in the firelight, listening for any sound that might signal something moving in the dark. But the night passed without incident. The only sounds were the normal noises of the forest, wind rustling the leaves, the occasional snap of a branch far off in the distance. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun had begun to rise, its light spilling through the trees and warming the cool air. I packed up my camp quickly, my mind still buzzing from the previous night. As I left the clearing, I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But the forest was just a forest again, calm, quiet, and normal. When I finally made it back to the trailhead hours later, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Something had been out there with me, something that wasn't quite right. But the woods had given me no answers, only the silence. I had never been camping in the mountains before, but when a group of friends invited me on a weekend trip deep into the woods, I thought it was the perfect chance to escape the monotony of daily life. We rented a small cabin just off a trail, far away from any nearby towns or civilization. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a way to disconnect from everything and enjoy the simple pleasures of nature. I wasn't expecting much, just some hiking, good food, and maybe a campfire or two. The first day went exactly as I imagined. We arrived in the early afternoon, settled into the cabin, and then set off on a short hike through the woods. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with a light breeze that made the leaves rustle above us. The trail wasn't difficult. It wound through tall pines and wide open spaces where the sunlight filtered down in streaks. We joked and laughed, taking in the sights and sounds, nothing too serious. When we returned to the cabin, we gathered around the fire pit outside and made dinner. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we shared stories, roasting marshmallows and watching the flames dance. That night, after we'd all gone to bed, I found it difficult to sleep. The quiet of the woods was almost unnerving. Every sound, an owl, a rustling branch, sounded amplified in the stillness of the night. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the cabin, listening to the occasional creak of the wooden walls and trying to ignore the way my mind kept playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was fitful. I kept waking up, half convinced that I heard something outside. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I woke with a start, hearing something I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a coyote moving through the woods, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. It was as if something or someone was circling the cabin. My heart started pounding. I lay still, listening. It was faint, but I could hear heavy footsteps on the soft forest floor, the crunch of leaves underfoot, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I had no idea who or what it was, but the thought of someone being that close, and in the middle of nowhere like this, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't dare move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. The footsteps seemed to pause and then resume again, a slow, deliberate pace, as if the person was trying to remain hidden. It was unnerving, but it could have been anyone. Another hiker, or maybe just someone from our group who had decided to take a midnight stroll. But as the minutes passed, that explanation didn't sit well with me. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, something wasn't right. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, and I was certain now that whatever was out there wasn't a friendly hiker. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of dread that kept me paralyzed in my sleeping bag. It wasn't until the sound stopped altogether that I allowed myself to breathe again. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I stayed awake the rest of the night, occasionally glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, watching us. The silence outside was deafening now. The forest had gone still, and I felt a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. When the first light of dawn finally crept in, I got up, still feeling uneasy. The others were still asleep, unaware of the strange events that had kept me up all night. I quietly got dressed and went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone having been out there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anything unusual had occurred. I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. As the day went on, I didn't mention what had happened to the others. Maybe I was being paranoid. I didn't want to ruin the mood or make anyone else feel uneasy. We went on another hike, a longer one this time, through a dense part of the woods that was supposed to be a great spot for wildlife watching. The forest was dense, with the trees crowding close together, their thick trunks blocking out much of the sunlight. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole hike, I kept looking over my shoulder, thinking I saw shadows moving behind the trees. At times, I even heard faint rustling, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. By the time we returned to the cabin, I was exhausted and on edge, but I tried to push my worries aside. I wasn't going to let my fear ruin the trip. That night, we sat around the campfire again, laughing and sharing stories. I kept my distance, feeling a little off, but I tried to enjoy the moment. As the night wore on, I found myself once again staring into the dark woods, the silence pressing down on me. There was no sound now except for the crackling fire, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Eventually, we all retired to the cabin to sleep. I had trouble falling asleep again, but this time, the noises I'd heard the previous night didn't return. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hours dragged on, and finally, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, I wasn't imagining it. I could hear them clearly, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig. The sound was closer now, and my heart began to race. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't a hiker. Whoever or whatever it was circling the cabin, just like last time. But this time, it was different. I could hear a faint scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the ground. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just stay silent this time. I needed to warn the others, but I didn't want to risk making a sound and drawing attention to myself. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I quietly moved to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out. What I saw made my stomach drop. A figure stood just outside the cabin, barely visible in the dim moonlight. They were tall, their silhouette shifting in the shadows, and they seemed to be staring straight at the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they stood sent a wave of cold fear through me. I froze, not daring to move, not wanting to be noticed. I watched for what felt like forever. My breath held, until the figure finally turned and started to walk away, slowly retreating into the woods. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things as quietly as I could and rushed to wake up the others. When they finally woke up, I told them everything. We didn't waste any time. Everyone packed up their things quickly, not asking too many questions, just wanting to leave. By the time the sun began to rise, we were on our way back down the trail, heading toward the nearest town. We never saw anything unusual after that night, but I don't think I'll ever forget the fear I felt. I don't know who or what was out there, but it was clear to me that something wasn't right in those woods. We all made it home safely, but I couldn't help but wonder what had been lurking out there, just beyond the trees, watching us. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I was around 14 or 15 years old when my family and I used to camp at this state park. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic campsite with a few other families scattered around the park. But what made it special was the woods. At night, my best friend and I would often take walks through the trees, just the two of us with our flashlights and nothing else. We didn't really have a clear goal when we went out there. It wasn't about hiking or exploring, but more about getting away from the adults, the noises of the campground, and just being kids in the dark woods. We called it the ritual, a little tradition we kept up every time we camped there. We always stayed close to the campsite, maybe walked a few hundred yards in, but on this particular night, we decided to go deeper. We didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was the quiet of the night or the idea of being further from the safety of the lights and the voices. The air was cooler than usual, and I remember the sound of our shoes crunching on the dry leaves as we walked along the overgrown trail. Our flashlights were off. We liked to navigate in the dark, feeling our way through the woods, using only our other senses. The faint rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the soft hum of insects in the night air. We had gone maybe half a mile when we stopped for a moment. The trees around us were thick, the kind that blocked out most of the moonlight. The woods felt alive in a way, like the kind of stillness that only happens when you're in a place untouched by human noise. And then we heard it. At first, it was faint, so faint that I thought I was imagining it. It sounded like whispering, but not the kind of whispering you'd hear from someone close by. It was distant, echoing through the trees, barely audible, like someone was speaking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. My friend looked at me, and I could tell from the look in his eyes that he'd heard it too. We both froze, standing there for a moment trying to make sense of it. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, turning the flashlight back on. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shapes, just the woods as they had been before. "Maybe it was an animal," I said, though it didn't sound convincing. There wasn't a rustling, no animals darting through the underbrush. It was just the whispering. We stood there for a while, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but something about the situation felt off. There's a kind of tension that builds when you're in the woods at night, especially when it's so quiet. After a few minutes of standing there, we shrugged it off and kept walking, deciding it was probably nothing. The whispering faded, and for a while, everything was back to normal. But then it happened again. This time, it wasn't as faint. It was clearer, closer, like the voice was coming from just behind us. We both spun around, hitting our flashlights, searching the trees behind us. But once again, there was nothing. No one in sight, no sounds of footsteps, just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt my heart pick up speed. My friend was looking at me, his face pale under the light of his flashlight. That's not right," he said. We stopped walking then, looking around. The whispering was so soft, like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. But it was there, clear as day. It didn't make sense. We should have turned back, I know that now, but we didn't. Instead, we stood there, trying to figure out what was going on. The woods were so still, so calm, and yet I could feel this sense of unease building in my chest. We decided to head back. It felt like the right thing to do, to turn around and retrace our steps to the safety of the campground. But just as we began to walk, the whispering came again. Only this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, faint voices layered on top of each other, blending together in a way that made it hard to distinguish individual words. It was like the whispers were circling us, coming from all around, but from no specific direction. My friend's grip on his flashlight tightened, and I could see the anxiety in his eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I also didn't want to seem scared. We had been out in the woods before, and nothing like this had ever happened. So we kept moving, though I could feel my pulse quicken with every step. And then, just as we reached a clearing, we saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow among the trees. But then, as our flashlights landed on her, I froze. She was crawling on the ground, her hands and knees scraping against the dirt. She was covered in dirt, her clothes dark and torn, and her face was hidden by the shadows. She wasn't moving like a person should. She was hunched low to the ground, crawling in this strange, jerky way. She was whispering to herself, but her words didn't make any sense. Just random, disconnected things, like she wasn't even aware of what she was saying. She didn't seem to notice us at first, but when she did, she stopped and slowly raised her head, staring at us through the darkness. Her eyes were wide, but there was no panic in them, just this eerie calmness that made my stomach twist. "What are you doing out here?" I managed to ask, though my voice felt small compared to the vastness of the woods around us. She slowly stood up, her movements stiff and unnatural. "I'm looking for my campsite," she said, her voice thick and slurred, like she was struggling to form the words. We just stood there, unsure of what to do. I could feel the tension in my chest, but we didn't want to leave her out there alone. She was obviously lost, disoriented, maybe even in trouble. She had to be, right? No one just crawls through the woods in the middle of the night without a reason. "Can we help you find it?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure how we could. She nodded, and we began walking with her, trying to get her back to the campground. She didn't say much as we walked, her steps slow and unsteady. Every now and then, she would mutter something under her breath, and I could barely make out the words. They didn't seem to fit together. I could tell that she was not in a good state of mind. My friend and I exchanged looks, the unease building between us. What was she doing out here like this? How had she ended up so far from her campsite? We walked for what felt like forever, the woods seeming to close in on us the further we went. The trees were so thick now that the moonlight barely reached the ground. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. When we finally reached the edge of the campground, we could see the lights of the tents in the distance. She seemed to recognize them, her pace picking up slightly as we neared the campsite. We could hear voices from the campground now, a mix of laughter and chatter. She didn't seem to want to acknowledge them, though. She just kept walking in silence. When we got to the main area, we found a few people sitting around a campfire. They were surprised to see her, and after a moment, one of them stood up, looking confused. "Where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you all night." She didn't respond. Instead, she just stood there, staring at them, still dazed. It was clear now. She was drunk, or worse, high. She had gotten lost in the woods while trying to find the bathroom or something. Her friends had no idea she was gone until we showed up. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. She wasn't in danger, at least not in the way we had thought. Still, the whole experience was unsettling. If we hadn't gone that far into the woods, she could have been lost out there all night, wandering around in a haze, unable to find her way back. We stayed for a while, just watching as her friends guided her back to the tent. They were laughing and shaking their heads, oblivious to the fact that she had been wandering around the woods, crawling on the ground, muttering to herself. It made me wonder how many people had been out there that night and had no idea what had been happening just beyond the campsite. As we walked back to our own site, my friend and I didn't speak. We just kept walking in silence, the weight of the night still hanging on us. It wasn't until we got back to our tents, sitting down by the fire, that we finally let out a breath. It had been a strange, creepy experience, one I would never forget. I didn't want to go back into the woods again, not anytime soon at least, but I knew that somehow it was one of those nights that would stick with me. The woods always felt different after that, like there were things out there in the dark that you couldn't explain, and sometimes you really don't want to know what they are.